thank you for inviting me to talk at the Politics in the Pub. This is the first time I've spoken at this venue. I've spoken, I think, over at Glebe on one previous occasion and over just at the Gaelic Club on one other occasion. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming out on the night of the budget speech, which I imagine most of you are anxious to avoid. I should tell you that I was dobbed in to speak tonight by Bob Carr in revenge for my having asked him to speak last year about this time at a Bickerton conference in Barrel, in which he and Tom Switzer and I all confidently predicted Hillary Clinton's victory. However, I'm not going to be speaking tonight about the election as it's projected at the moment. This image here is really just decorative background, so that when you get tired of looking at me, you can look at the seats that the Democratic Party won and the states they won them in the elections of 2018. Now, the question I've been asked to talk about is Trump versus democracy the real issue? Now, not surprisingly, the answer to that question is yes. And in the time allotted to me, I'll try and explain why. It's hard to know where to begin because there's so much commentary. The commentariat are talking all the time about every aspect of the election. But one of the problems with the commissariat is that there are far too few historians among them. And some of you may be a bit disappointed tonight with what you're going to hear, because it's going to be more of a history lecture than it is a political science analysis. So let me begin at the beginning. It might be easier for all of us if I mention my starting assumptions and set out some basic facts before getting into what may become some complicated details. The first thing to recognise is that in the United States, the President, as holder of the highest elected officer in the land, is revered. I use the word revered advisedly. He is regarded, or she is regarded, if she gets elected, as a demigod. Secondly, the United States is a highly conservative country. It has never embraced what you or I would regard as full democracy. It has been argued that the nation only became a fully inclusive and robust democracy, even in its own terms, following the resolution of the constitutional crisis created by Nixon over Watergate and the Vietnam War in the 1970s. Thirdly, democracy in the United States works best at the local rather than the national level. That is in part because the nation is made up of 50 individual and fundamentally independent states united only in a federal system. It is probably more accurate to call the country these United States. To illustrate the above points, just let me give you some simple examples. In the presidential election of 2000, the percentage of of 2000, that's correct, the percentage of eligible voters who cast their vote was just over 50%. And that figure has never risen above 57% in the elections since then. In 2016, only 55.5% of those eligible to vote did so. Now, in real terms, what that amounts to is this. In November 2016, the Census Bureau estimated that there were 245.5 million Americans aged 18 or above. About 157 million of whom were reported as registered to vote. That is to say, about 64% of the US voting age population. Approximately 136 million voted in the elections, and put another way, the victor received the approval of just over half of 2/3 of the adult population. Now just think about that. This is a country that claims to be the greatest democracy in the world. The victor wins just over half of 2/3 of the voting population. Measured against the OECD nations, the United States is placed 26th out of 32 in voting participation in national elections. Furthermore, the nation does not even have a uniform system for the election of a president. Each state sets its own rules as to who is eligible to vote and the circumstances in which the election is held. Elections in most states, the election day in most states is not a public holiday, and most people work on Tuesday, the day the presidential election takes place. To complicate the matter further, the US founders were fearful of dictatorship, but at the same time they were suspicious of the power of the people. The system of 3 separate branches of government they designed, in which they hoped each branch would temper the power of the other 2, gave only indirect power to the people. The intermediary they created between the people as voters, which as we know excluded slaves, 12 to 15% of the population, and women, but of course they were not alone in that respect, was the Electoral College. That's the intermediary organisation or structure that's placed between the voter and the outcome. And I will talk more about the Electoral College later, but now I simply want to make the point that the relationship between the 3 branches of government, the executive, the legislature, which has 2 houses, and the judiciary, which comprises of circuit courts, appeals courts, and the Supreme Court, it has always been fractious, with power constantly contested between them. And fourthly, and this is where we actually get onto the topic in a more specific sense, Trump is a populist, one of a number of authoritarians who have risen to national leadership in the past decade around the democratic world. Populists attract and thrive upon adulation. They are broad-stroke people who are untroubled by truth or detail. They are opportunists who bring everything back to themselves. They are reductionists who simplify issues in order to amplify their own message. So given that context, what can we now say about what is happening in the United States in this presidential year and Trump's place in that? There is no doubt that Trump is seeking to extend or expand and consolidate his power at the expense of what we might regard as the traditional norms of US government. History indicates that populists are dangerous, pose a real danger to democracy. But it is worth noting and reminding ourselves that populist leaders do not simply fall out of the sky. I was going to make a mention about another populist leader closer to home, but I've been instructed by the Commander-in-Chief not to mention his name.
I think we might know.
Anyway, that they do not simply fall out of the sky. Certain conditions provide the breeding ground for them. These conditions include extreme political polarization, conflict over who should and should not participate or belong to the political community, high and growing economic inequality, and excessive executive power. When one or more of these conditions exist, democracy is prone to decay. In a powerful essay, The Fragile Republic, that appears in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, published by the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Susan Mettler and Robert Lieberman argue that today, under Trump, the United States faces all these dangers more than ever. During his term of office, Trump has taken a number of steps that have weakened democracy. So, he has first of all sought to limit and restrict the power of the press through his intimidation and abuse of mainstream media and his extraordinary use of Twitter. He has increased the distrust Americans have in their government and governmental institutions through his hiring and firing and abuse of officials and personnel staff. He has especially cast doubt on the role and efficacy of the FBI and the CIA and the National Security institutions. He has polarised the political system to the point that neither party trusts the other or will work with the other in Congress, resulting in a legislative paralysis, and in so doing, he has sought to concentrate power in the executive branch. Republicans and Democrats now behave more as fanatical followers, believers, tribal members, rather than members or supporters of a political party in which compromise in dealing with each other is essential. The closest relevant comparison I can make to this that you might remember, is the divisions and hatred that existed within the Labor Party in Australia during the period of the Democratic Labor Party that kept Labor from winning office for more than a decade. That's as close as I can come to anything similar to the level of distrust and hatred that exists between the political parties in the US at the moment. Now, when I was reading up on the recent presidential debate, I came across these remarks of Marcus Cicero that seem to apply to Donald Trump. A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious. And we're sort of evidence of that ourselves. No. But it cannot survive treason from within. The enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves among those within the gate freely, his shy whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in every hall of government itself. In particular, Trump's performance put me in mind of the words attributed to Abe Lincoln: better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak up and remove all doubt. So in what passed for the recent first presidential debate last week, Trump made two statements that clearly identify areas in which he is a clear and fundamental danger to democracy. The first was his answer to a question concerning the current wave of unrest sweeping the nation, and the second was his refusal to state that he would accept the outcome of the election. Let us begin with the issue of mob violence. Trump was asked if he would condemn the white supremacist race-based hate militia groups in the United States. Instead of doing so, he signalled his support to his base by stating, "Almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing." And he added, "Proud Boys, stand back and stand by." He justified his support by stating that somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left because, referring to the violence in Portland, Oregon and other cities, This is not a right-wing problem, this is a left-wing problem. Now, this was a chilling moment, and we should note at least three things about it. It is exactly, and I mean exactly, the defence offered by Adolf Hitler in May 1931, when he was charged with being complicit in the works of gangs who had beaten and killed anti-fascists in Germany. The second thing to note about Trump's comment is that it is wrong. It is simply false. Between January 1994 and May of 2000, white supremacists and other right-wing extremist gangs have carried out attacks that have killed around 330 people. During the same period, only one person has been killed in an anti-fascist activity, and that person was the anti-fascist leader himself. The rate of killings in 2019 to 2020 by the right compared to the left is 300 to 1. According to the centrist think tank, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, right-wing extremists perpetrated 2/3 of the attacks and plots in the United States in 2019 and over 90% between January and May 2020. The most notable incidents, and I don't want to go into these details because we won't have enough time. I don't know what the time is.
That's all right. You've got another 5 or 10 minutes.
Only that much. Right. I'll have to go faster. Anyway, there was the incident in which you remember the person drove the car into the crowd in Charlottesville and killed the person. And there was the killing of 11 worshippers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and more than 100 other incidents of cars being driven into protesters. The third thing to notice about Trump's statement is that violence has always played a prominent part in US history. The right-wing racists who currently bear arms in defence of the president are part of a long tradition of Americans resorting to vigilantism when they believe the law is not protecting their interests. Now, this may sound as if in some way it is a defence of Trump, what I'm about to say. It is not exactly a defence of Trump, but what it does do is put what we are seeing on our screens today in some kind of historical context. The United States has always been a place of institutional racism and violence. Slavery, after all, was legal until 1865, long after it had been abolished peacefully in Europe and Latin America. The US government and its military did the bulk of the dispossessing of Native Americans. Police departments cooperated early on with the Ku Klux Klan, and today's police officials continue to kill a disproportionate number of African Americans. Mobs have eagerly cooperated with state institutions on the basis of shared racism. The mob has occupied an unusually prominent role in history because Americans have cultivated a unique hostility towards the state and its institutions that go back to the early days of the Republic. Historian Michael Pfeiffer notes in his groundbreaking book, The Roots of Rough Justice, that violent libertarianism associated with the American Revolution and the subsequent lack of a strong centralized state gave rise to violence long before the Civil War and after it. These mobs didn't necessarily think of themselves as anti-democratic. Rather, they imagined they were improving democracy. As Pfeiffer points out, many of the vigilante outfits had their own system of their own democratic processes. They adopted bylaws and elected officials in their own leaders. They held mock trials and they did all sorts of things about the punishment. In other words, they formulated, in a sense, a state or a parallel state. And almost exactly a year ago, in July of 1917, in St. Louis, white mobs didn't care who they killed as long as their victims were black. They murdered people in public with guns and rocks. It was a prelude to what was called the Red Summer, which lasted from 1919 to 1926, in which thousands of African Americans were killed in places like Rosewood, Florida. In 1923, white mobs killed thousands of blacks in 26 cities, Chicago, Houston and Washington. In 1921, in a slaughter that has been well documented, white citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, destroyed the country's wealthiest African American community. So, German sociologists famously defined the state, Max Weber famously defined the state as possessing a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. But in the United States, and that's in a way more or less the European-German tradition, but in the United States, the state only aspired to possess such a monopoly. And that is the situation we're in at the moment with Trump. It's the aspiration to it. And we would be very foolish indeed if we didn't recognise that what is happening is far less inflammatory, serious in terms of numbers of lives lost, scale of violence, compared to the previous 200 years of US history. It is the way it is, if you like, in the US. Now, during the Trump administration, these mobs have again moved out of the shadows into the limelight. Militia movements and right-wing extremists are starting to turn out in force to intimidate racial justice and anti-Trump demonstrators. And I can go on here and say there's a survey that indicated that among Republican parties there's a strong feeling that we have a Marxist mob perpetrate historic levels of violence and disorder in American cities. And if the only thing that stands between the American dream and total anarchy and madness and chaos is our use of force. Now, Trump has advocated and supported these mobs long before he became president and when he was president. And even before he became president, he was elected president with people knowing what his views on these matters were. Now, which brings us to another important element in assessing the degree to which Trump is a danger to democracy. Although he is his own greatest cheerleader and consistently and repeatedly exaggerates and distorts his own achievements in every area of life, Trump is in reality quite ineffectual and weak as an authoritarian leader. Ask yourself, what has he achieved in terms of legislation since achieving office? Virtually nothing. We see him signing executive orders from time to time and holding them up for us to view on television. We see it's worth thinking about executive orders. Executive orders are really proclamations which simply celebrate important events or days or people, like Veterans Day or something. Now, Trump has signed 181 of those since he achieved office. Obama, in his term of office, that's about 51 a year. Obama's average was 34 a year, not many less. And John F. Kennedy signed 45 a year. FDR signed 570 a year. And Woodrow Wilson, 225. Now you might say, well, these are wartime presidents, and there's a lot more proclamations or declarations or executive much. It doesn't require congressional approval. And if you compare Coolidge and Hoover and Harding, Republican presidents in the 1920s, they signed about 200 a year. So if you're assessing Trump, you could say he's a bit lazy. Because of the polarization that he's encouraged, the Republican-controlled Senate has not considered almost 400 pieces of legislation passed by the Democrats to the Senate for approval. So no legislation has come through for him to sign or approve or disapprove or veto or anything else. The nation, in other words, is in a state of paralysis legislatively. He has lost 7 Republican governorships during his term. Even on the question of election fraud, Trump comes nowhere near the level of corruption carried out by Nixon and his administration. Many presidents have been guilty of corruption over the years. Ulysses S. Grant and Warren Harding, to mention just 2 Republican presidents. He has taken the United States out of alliances and trade deals, so the nation is more isolated and more answerable. But despite his much vaunted ability as a deal maker, he has proven inept at making deals with other autocratic and despotic leaders. In fact, he's regarded by Putin as something, and other leaders in Europe, as something of a joke. As president, Trump has refused to take responsibility for anything. He says he's not responsible for the more than 200,000 COVID-19 deaths, or the pandemic-induced economic collapse, and certainly not for the racial activities that have been taking place in the wave of protests. In particular, Trump is control of, or his exhortations to the right-wing extremists in comparison to the way the state has used force, or enabled it and supported mobs, is somewhat limited. So, I want now, though, to move on to the next statement that we were going to talk about, namely his refusal to accept the outcome of this election. And that is perhaps even more disturbing, if you could think it would be more disturbing than what I've just been talking about. Trump has called into question the very legitimacy of the elections and the election process. I'll be finished in 10 minutes. Process. He has said that the system is rigged and that he will only accept the decision of the election if he is re-elected. He has also dismissed charges that there was foreign interference that assisted in his own victory in 2016, which I think is pretty terrific. In all of this, he has been supported by the Republican Party. Now, it is historic when a president, in his chaotic news conferences and Twitters, refuses in advance to accept the results of the coming election. We're going to have to see what happens. You know that. I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster. There is not going to be a change, there is going to be a continuation, he asserted. Now, the Atlantic magazine has just published its November issue 2 or 3 weeks early because it contains an article by a man called Barton Gellman, which sets out some possible scenarios as to what might happen if Trump is defeated by Biden in the popular vote. The trouble is that we now get into the realms of prediction. But the author, Gellman, is in no doubt that unless Biden wins by a huge, huge landslide, an outcome that Gellman thinks is unlikely, and I think so does everybody else, Trump, given his personality, his many declarations that the election is rigged or crooked, and his past record of refusal to accept any unpalatable situations, will indeed challenge the results and eventually prevail. Gelman points out, Gelman points out, depends upon, and this is a little known dimension of this that I don't think anybody's picked up. Victory depends upon the loser conceding to the victor in the United States system. Until the loser says, "You've won, I give up," there's still a contested election outcome. Now, Trump, Gelman believes, will never concede. Okay, so what's the story? Gelman's analysis consists of two dimensions. In the first, he looks at the way in which the Republican national and state committees are planning and are already implementing plans to intimidate and repress Democratic voters by the use of so-called sheriffs and up to 50,000 volunteer armed observers at precincts in 15 contested states, allegedly to ensure ballot security. The Republican National Committee will especially target the anticipated 80% of votes that will be mailed in, the great majority of which will be cast by Democrats, especially in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. And I was listening today that in Minnesota they're expecting over 1 million mail-in votes. Now Minnesota was won by, well, I can't see there, but was won by Hillary in 2016. It's a Democratic state. She won by 2%. There's going to be over 1 million mail-in votes or more. They're very confident they'll be secure, but Trump's boys will be there intimidating, harassing, bullying, inspecting, preventing Democratic voters going to the polls. Now, and they will be aided in all of this by the Postmaster General, Louis Deloy. Trump hopes to slow the counting of these votes. Just two things, the casting of them and then the counting of them. And this is the second dimension that Gelman focuses on, the process after Election Day, which he anticipates in which he anticipates we will not know the outcome, because the count will not be conclusive on the night of the election. The first key date is December the 8th, 35 days after the election. That day is known as the safe harbour deadline. This is the final day for appointing the 538 men and women who make up the Electoral College. Here we are back at the Electoral College. Usually the electors are made up of members of the winning party in each state. In other words, each state, it's not too dissimilar in a way to the Liberal and Labor Party in the Australian states, and the 50 states. Each state, each party in each state elects a group of electors. The number of electors they elect depend upon the number of votes they have, the number of Congress people they have in the Congress. It might be worth just looking very briefly. At this map, you can see, for example, that California has 55. That means that when the Californian Democratic Committee or the California Republican Committee meet, they will elect 55 people who they will send to the Electoral College depending on which of those two parties wins the election, win on the night. And that's the way it's always been. And that date for deciding that is December the 8th. That is the appointment of those people. They've then got a situation in which, but Gelman describes a number of scenarios in which the result is in dispute or in litigation in a particular state. So let's say in California that we don't know who's won. And California's not a good example because it'll easily win. Let's take North Carolina. And North Carolina here has, I think, got something like 16, 15 or 16 electors. Now, so they're uncertain who's won because they can't count the votes. So they don't know who they're going to send to the next meeting when they meet on December the 18th to count the votes. Because when they get there, they then have to present their votes to both houses of Congress. And that has to be done by January the 6th. And then between January the 6th and January the 20th, the Congress has to approve what they've been sent by the Electoral College in order for the inauguration to take place on January the 20th. So there are 79 days between the election and the inauguration, during which time, if you can raise enough doubt in enough states, or in any particular state or a crucial state that might make the difference between getting more than 270, which is half of 538 or whatever it is, you don't have an outcome. And you don't have an outcome until it gets to Congress. And then who makes the decision in Congress? The President of the Senate. That's Pence. Now, if Pence makes that decision, guess what? Trump wins. But if the Democrats take the Senate, then it'll be a Democratic President of the Senate, and Biden will win. But it may still be, and even if they can't agree, well, what could happen is, even if the Republicans win the Senate, Pelosi can simply refuse to allow the Democrats to sit in on the final decision. And since the rules say they have to be approved by the whole of Congress, they're not approved by the House. Now, this has happened twice in the past, and they've generally reached a compromise before the 20th. But it could be, according to Gilman and others, a situation in which they don't reach a compromise because Trump is not going to concede defeat, and the Democrats feel that they should. So two people turn up for the inauguration. Nobody knows what will happen at that point. That's the end of the game. So all we can say is let's hope that somewhere between November the 6th and January the 20th, some sanity prevails. That's about all I can tell you about that. I was going to be talking about foreign policy and one thing and another, and I won't, but I just will end up with a statement that I think summarises what I would be wanting to say about foreign policy. 15 years ago, in 1905, Harold Pinter, the British playwright, in his Nobel Prize-winning lecture, observed that the Americans had committed crimes that have been systematic, systemic, constant, vicious, remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a quite clinical manipulation of power worldwide while masquerading as a force for universal good. It's a brilliant, even witty, highly successful act of hypnosis. Thank you very much.
I have a question about the electoral colleges. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in the last election, the things seem to be swayed so that in a state like California, if the vote goes only like 51% for a given party, then the electoral college, the whole 55 votes will go for that one, so that
Yes, the situation in most cases, except two or three, and I forgot what they were, I think there's New Hampshire, The other might be Nebraska, which is kind of crazy because Nebraskans actually believe in democracy. Winner takes all in the electoral college count. So if you win by 2% of the vote, 2% more than your opponent, you get all the delegates from that state. I should tell you that if, let's say that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party members of the Electoral College, when they are counting the votes in their state, can't agree on which ones are fraudulent and which ones are legitimate. Okay? They can't agree on that, so what happens then? Well, the governor can simply say, the vote is so confused and there's so much disagreement and there's such a high chance of corruption and fraud that we will have to make the decision in both houses of the legislature of this state. The governor can decide that. Okay? So in 6 of the 6 contested states, both houses of the legislatures of those states are Republican, and so is the governor. Now, I'm not a cynical sort of person, and I believe in the goodness of mankind, but given that case, it wouldn't be hard for me to imagine a situation in which there was a lot of confusion about the result when a Democrat was only winning by 6%. We'd have to go to the legislature, and the legislature then sends its decision to the governor, and the governor then sends that to Congress. And by the way, these results all go to the National Archives and are recorded, and when it's recorded in the archives, Congress can do nothing about it. They send the document off. They don't meet in any one place. They're all meeting in their local state capitals or cities that they decide to meet in. So that goes off. But in some states, where you don't have the same party holding the legislative upper house and the lower house, the governor himself can decide, or herself can decide. And if in fact, even if both houses are Republican but the governor is the Democrat, the Democratic governor can say, well, you can't trust these Republicans in the legislature, they're just being political. This is going to have to be my decision, and I'm sending off the delegates from the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. Now, if you don't think that this is an absolutely flawed, chaotic, and undemocratic system of electing a person, then you've got no idea of what you've... And this is a country that says, sends observers to observe what's happening in Belarus, or Russia, or Nigeria for that matter. I mean, these boys at least stand up and say, listen, you vote the other way, you get shot dead, here's a machine gun, don't vote that way. So at least you've got a choice, you know what you're doing. In the United States, you think you know what you're doing, you've got no idea. Because most of the time, so what we have to have is what political scientists, and I love political scientists because they've always got pithy phrases that we historians don't have because we're too busy trying to find out what's actually happening. If the balance of victory is so high, is high enough, it will eliminate the balance of litigation. In other words, if the balance is, say, 12%, the likelihood of a court deciding that that's a fraudulent vote or it should go to the other party is zilch. I don't know what the figure actually is. It would depend a lot on the judge or on the court. But, and this brings us to the question of Amy Coney Barrett, and did she make a difference? in terms of being a Republican elected to the Supreme Court. Let me tell you something about the Supreme Court that most people know but don't want to think about. That is to say, once you've given a person lifelong tenure and you've told them they're the most powerful group of people in the world, guess what happens when I tell them what to do? They tell me to go and chase myself. Or to use an Australian expression, don't go and tell me to bite my bum. Okay? So, Amy Coney Barrett is not necessarily, and if she for 1 second believes that if anything comes before the Supreme Court on this election because it's politically motivated, they are dead in the water. She will not vote for something that is not legally watertight. And there is a line somewhere between that level of voter fraud, which is 0.009% of traditional mailed-in votes are dismissed as being fraudulent or, not fraudulent, what's the other word I want here? Invalid. And, you know, so the likelihood of it, if the margin of victory is 5%, I would say, then the margin of the balance of litigation is 0. But that's what it comes down to in the end.
And that went against Clinton, didn't it?
What?
That
Went against law. Yeah.
that disadvantaged Clinton,
Well,
the electoral, the way the electoral college.
Yes, it can.
Okay, we've got a couple of people with their hands up. We've got someone here and someone at the back.
Thank you. Two questions concerning the media. Certainly in Australia, the last few elections had a huge influence in the Murdoch media, and I understand Murdoch also has a lot of media interest in the US. So the first question is, the media in general in the US, is it more leaning towards Trump, or is that sort of is it a bit more complex than that? And the second question concerns the Fox News, because the Fox News certainly tends to be associated more with the sort of Republicans, more of that Bush era, you know, with the neocons, you know, supporting interventionist wars and so on. Whereas the Republicans, certainly that sort of aspect seems to have changed under Trump, that more isolationist sort of views. So I was just wondering how Fox News then sort of sees that very big shift in the Republicans, and whether they're also still full on supporting Trump, or so Fox News and the media in general in the US.
Yes. Look, I'm not the best person to talk about the media, because I think the media, if one listens to the media, you would think it was the most important dimension or aspect of life in the world. I think it's a self-serving circle that the media have about its own importance. I'm not sure how important it is, nor do I know, and it's impossible to know unless you're in the United States, how the media is reporting, because there are so many local radio stations, local television stations, local newspapers that people read beyond the major networks. The major networks, overall, I think, are somewhat hostile to Trump, and are becoming more so, particularly in view of his behaviour in relation to COVID. It's not simply that he's failed to act, it's that in coming down with the infection as he has, not only has that shocked people, it's polarised them in the sense that some people say, well, it shows his courage, his resilience, and his determination. But others are saying that it shows his irresponsibility and recklessness. And he hasn't done himself a lot of favours in the last day or two with his rather manic conduct under the medication he's in on disregarding the wearing of masks and so on. So I think, regardless even of their overall political, ideological positions in relation to Trump, on the day-to-day, down-to-earth, how is it affecting individuals' lives, I think there is a swing against Trump's conduct. And that's, but we won't know, and it'll have to play itself out. And I think it's an impossible thing myself to assess. And, well, that's just my view on that. Does that answer to your question? Yeah.
Hello.
Somebody else
Yeah.
next.
Hello.
Uh,
Oh.
It's got to be green. The line should be green.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Professor. That was extremely interesting. I just wondered if, coming in and out, if you could comment on the other side of the equation. You're saying that the right, far right, is mobilising and preparing. Essentially, what we're talking about is that we have to raise the distinct possibility of civil war in the United States. And I mean, I have heard reports that in addition to these, everyone in the United States is armed. I saw some figure, I don't know what it is, 300 million arms or 500 million arms. But even on the left, people are starting to form armed groups.
Yeah.
And that, you know, I mean, the potential, if he refuses to accept the result of the election, and we might see an actual breakout of conflict in the
Yes.
United States.
I'm pleased you mentioned the gun business. I had a half a page or more on guns, but I didn't want to bore you completely to death. And of course, guns are an essential element in the whole rise of vigilante groups and extremist groups and the reign of terror that they create, whether they're on the right or the left. And there is no doubt that there are those among the Democrats and on the left who recognise that or who believe that they do need to arm themselves against the armed observers and demonstrators who mass gather in the streets. And the likelihood of civil war is not so much a civil war, so much, I believe, as armed repression by the police and the National Guard of all those who are demonstrating, whether it's on the left or the right, or whether they're demonstrating for goodness or racist reasons. And that comes back to the fact that the Pentagon have militarised, and the executive and the police forces and the FBI have militarised the police to the point where now you will have, that they will certainly repress these organized groups, and it will be at a high cost. But don't forget, and I was in the United States in the summer of 1968. There were tanks on the main streets of the main cities of the United States in probably 10 or 15 states. They were wandering around up and down with tanks. There were armed militiamen on the streets of Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and Philadelphia and other cities in the United States. This is nothing new. I'm not condoning it in any way, but I'm saying, while it's alarming to us, and while it's a contradiction of the ideals and the imagery and the rhetoric that the United States projects about itself to the world and to itself, it's not novel. And we simply have to recognise that it is a possibility, and it's a very likely outcome.
Yes, you were next and then. Yes.
Okay, my question. Thank you for your talk, because I really love historical perspective on things. And my question deals with given the facts that you give about history, doesn't that mean that Donald Trump was an inevitable event in American history? And my second question deals with the future. It looks like you are forecasting a growing militarization or fascism in the United States. But fascism rises because there is a militaristic leader that rose from the ranks, which Trump isn't. And I see no militaristic leader in America rising from the ranks. So what silver lining or what bright future could America look forward to after the smoke clears?
That's an interesting set of comments, and let me address them in order. There is no doubt that there are many who believe that Trump himself is really the spokesperson or the instrument of other groups, essentially financially based groups or groups with financial and global interests who are using him to further an agenda which we don't know. Now, there's a lot of that kind of analysis that's going on, and there is no doubt that the process of globalization which had been taking place, or the liberal order that has been prevailing for the past 20 years, was reaching a crisis point. And it was reaching a crisis point because of the inequalities were getting greater, not less. The wealth was accumulating in the hands of fewer rather than more, and at obscene levels, unlike the levels we'd seen previously. And all of that against a backdrop of a rising economy in China that is going to threaten the stability of that global international order, which, remember, we call it a global international order. It is simply a system whereby the United States seeks to retain economic dominance over as much of the world as possible. I don't want to get into this in a way because it's too depressing for a lot of people, and it's too frightening for others. The United States has bases in 198 cases around, military bases around the world. And they're not there because they like the climate or it's a better place to do war exercises or something like that. They're there to ensure that American financial, commercial, investment interests and other political interests are being preserved and protected, and against what they see as potential enemies, which of course are the vast majority of the people of the globe who are still, except for China, where there is a rapid increase in the standard of living in conditions which don't seem to be matching the rhetoric which we're hearing from the internationalists. So in one sense, that's true. But to get to your second point, but only in one sense, because there's always checks and balances. The British, after all, had an empire for 2 centuries. I believe empires last about a century and a half, 2 centuries, and then they begin to decline. The British were lucky with 2 centuries, but then they're the Brits and no one was paying much attention, and so there they were. They had a free run. And they also had a navy which was second to none, and so on. But you're asking about the rise of fascism. Make no mistake about this. Fascism does not depend on armed forces for its success. It depends on legal instruments. Mussolini took from 1921 to 1929 to consolidate power. That's 8 years. Hitler took from 1931 to 1939 to consolidate power. That's a long time. And he didn't do it only with fascist gangs or military groups. He did it because he had a legislature. He intimidated, he closed down the press, he intimidated legislatures so that legislation would pass that would prevent people from expressing their points of view and doing all sorts of things. And that is what, to take Barr, for example, the Attorney General, who is supposed to be an independent figure in the US administrative bureaucracy, he ordered the National Guard to clear Lafayette Square on the instructions of the President so he could hold up a Bible in front of a church he never goes to. And they used military force. It wasn't a fascist gang. It wasn't even a left-wing gang. It was the National Guard under the control of the Attorney General. Flynn is currently, Flynn is under indictment, and Barr has changed the laws so that that indictment will not involve the President. The man called Cohen, who was his financial advisor, is now being protected by the Attorney General under litigation. Now, these are the instruments, the legal instruments. They are not military things, not military tactics or ventures. So we've got to constantly, and that's why, for example, in this country, right now, here we go again, with a member of the Legislative Council of New South Wales, whose house has been raided with no public information. The press were informed, notified, we've got no information about this. Why is this happening? Why has the press not launched a full-scale attack on these infringements of a legislator, not you or me, who have no rights of any kind, and will kiss us goodbye, unless we happen to be known to the Premier or the Prime Minister married to their daughter or some kind of thing, or son or something. I don't know. But if we don't have contact, you can kiss us goodbye. So I'm not... And Trump isn't yet ready, because he doesn't have the power. He aspires to the power, as Weber says, to use military force. But he will, if he has to, and it will take the time to do it.
Can I
Yes.
just...
Yeah. Well, this lady was wanting to ask a question.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask, given that the system's so convoluted and so incredibly difficult to follow, do I have to press
Yes,
it?
it's all right. Just talk. Just talk.
So given that the system's so convoluted, would you say that the vast majority of voters, especially Trump voters,
Yeah, I can hear you.
We'll repeat the question.
they would not understand the system? They just throw their hands up and say, well, you know, it's beyond most people's comprehension. In America, they wouldn't understand that system.
No, they don't. The question was, well, what about the average citizen? How can they possibly cope with all of this? And why wouldn't they just throw their hands up? Well, of course, as we see, 40% do anyway, regardless.
That's possibly
right. But it ignores the other dimension to it. I was going to read out, but I won't. But I'll forget, because if I don't read it, I've forgotten, because I've got a memory like a sieve. Democracy and government in the United States is at a local level. They participate in local elections like crazy. Okay? Now, they elect everybody. We elect our councillors, but that's about it. Who else do we elect? They elect
State
them.
government.
What?
State government.
Oh, no, but at a local level. At a local level, who do we elect? Nothing after the council. They elect their school districts, boards, they elect their sheriff, they elect their dog catcher, they elect local magistrates, they elect every bugger they can find to do every job at a local level. And to them, as in our case, we are much more ruled by our local government decisions than we are by Macquarie Street or Canberra in day-to-day activities. We're put in a context by these national and state organisations. So they don't care about their... I've had so many conversations with Americans as to why you don't vote. And they said, what's the point of voting? I mean, everything I need and want, I get through these votes around here. I don't need to worry about what's happening at the national level. And that's why taxes become an issue, and such a big issue, because taxes affect your income directly. But once you've been taxed, well, you know, you can manage with what you've got left, the way we all do. Yes.
As a refugee from Nazi Germany,
Yes.
with my parents
Yes.
learning 3 languages for years,
Yes.
wondering which country we would get entry to,
Yes.
I must argue with you about Hitler gaining power in 1939. He gained power
Oh, yes,
a
ma'am.
long time before that.
Yes, he did. But yes, you're absolutely right. Of course he did. But it was the question about how long it took Hitler to gain power. And of course he was in power long before that. But I only used 39 because that was when he initiated activities that led to the war. That's all. You're absolutely right. But the point remains. Yeah, the point remains. That's right. I agree with what you're saying. What I am saying back to you is that I agree with what you're saying, but he's still using the law as well as the brown shirts and everything up until the 30s at least.
He was still using the brown shirts.
Yes, of course he was. Yes, absolutely, of course he was. And he terrorised. And we're nowhere...
I saw it with my
Yeah,
own
yeah,
eyes.
and we're nowhere near that in the United States.
I think you just have to keep persisting with talking.
Yeah.
You've turned it off.
Absolutely. And we're nowhere near that in the United States or in Australia or any other Western democracy that we know of. That's absolutely right. I agree with you. Yes, the microphone's off. It's coming and going because
I think the battery's just getting a
the
bit
battery's
low.
getting
So is there another question?
yeah.
Oh, sorry. There's one there and then...
Is this coming through or?
Yes.
Just speak up.
Speak up.
Use the microphone.
Use the microphone.
Just
Do
use the
both.
microphone.
Do both.
Raise your voice.
Raise your voice. I'd like to pick up on what you said about interests at play and just ask if it's possible that we could work from that to produce a different perspective to understand, pardon me, what's happening with democracy in the States. And that is, it seems to me, there's 3 factors which are pressing on the situation. One is the search by USA, shorthand for the American leadership, to pursue being globally supreme. All through the 20th century, there have been other countries that have been globally supreme, notably the British 19th century. The 20th century has been the era of USA global supremacy. The 2 forces I see us feeding into that. I remember just when Trump gave his acceptance speech, I was listening to it on the ABC, and he said he'd like to thank the 220 ex-admirals and generals who supported him in his campaign. And it seems to me that if you're looking to maintain that supremacy, if you need that to happen, you not only need the military behind you, but in terms of ensuring the provision of a workforce that's going to help you do that, you need the Catholic Church. That is because who produces workers? But women produce workers. As Noam Chomsky said, you have to watch what's going on the ground. It's in the Republican states that the anti-abortion legislation is coming in. Controlling women and what they do is absolutely crucial to this. And it seems to me that when one big power is in conflict with another, democracy, it seemed to be sacrificable. Democracy shrinks because the leaderships feel you can't really afford it because it gets in the way. And this relates and synchronises into what's happening in Australia because, you know, we have had a secret trial going on in this country and I've never seen that before. But I think Scott Morrison, as much as Trump feels that we can't afford democracy to the extent that we used to, it's shrinking and it's being made to shrink because the USA, on the one hand, with Britain in behind it, is confronting Russia and China on the other side. And for those reasons, democracy is not affordable. Do you think that's a worthwhile perspective to look at this thing? I know it is depressing. I get depressed. But I think it's the truth.
Well, that's really another lecture, isn't it? The degree to which a nation can remain a democracy and an extended territory. It's the question that the founding fathers debated in the 1780s. Is it possible to be a democracy and control a larger area, an extended area? And their view was that if you put in enough checks and balances, as they thought they had, you could. I think it depends on what you see as democracy. I'm struck by, and this is the story that Manning Clark used to tell his students every year, and it stuck with me really. In the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky has Christ return to the earth to see how things are coming along with what he planned for the world. And while he's on earth, he meets up with Satan, and this is all described in this chapter. And Satan says to Christ, look, Christ, you're losing this battle because you promised men freedom and liberty. And what they want is bread. So I've promised them bread, and you've promised them freedom. And guess who's winning the argument? So it seems to me that if you're providing a standard of living that is adequate, then people will find means of finding social discourse with civility. And if you've got civility and social discourse and a standard of living, why don't you call this democracy? Well, I don't know what democracy is if it's not, and if that is the goal of democracy and you've got it, why aren't you calling it democracy? So to me, I don't see an immediate conflict. What I do see is that powers in relation to other powers, that is states, in relation to other states, seek to dominate them, and in doing so they resort to force, and in doing that they trample on both the civil discourse, the capacity of people to live together in a peaceful manner, and the standard of living of those who are supporting them and whom they are attacking. So you destroy what you are seeking to gain. Now that's a roundabout way of saying that's a very good question, and I wish I had a good answer.
Okay, Stephen, and then Anna.
I'm not quite sure how to frame this question, but I did tell people, the Assange people who are on Friday after 4 p.m. on the steps of the town hall, that they should come here.
Yeah.
But I haven't succeeded in impressing on them how wonderful politics in the pub really is, and fully demonstrated this evening, and thank you. Judge Pereira says she's going to announce the decision about Assange after the election in January. January in the US, which is bizarre. Have you had any, because it's not meant to be a political thing, and that's the law is not meant to be tied to elections like this. I just wonder if you've had any thoughts about what we can stop to denounce, and if that's your feeling, the global reach of the United States in this way, which is completely illegitimate, non-legitimate. That's my view, and the invalidity of this whole process that's trying to get an Australian citizen to the United States from Britain, and the Australian government has got nothing to say about that. So it's a bit left field.
I think you're missing the point really. What we are concerned about in this country is jobs, jobs and jobs. And jobs take precedence over everything else, including other jobs. As long as you keep using the word jobs and infrastructure, you're home free. So, I mean, I find the British government's actions and the Australian government's actions in relation to asylum totally reprehensible. But I also know that while we value individual freedoms, we value our political careers more if we are in government, and it just seems to me that we have chosen, for reasons which I think are deeply flawed, to tie our banner to that of the United States, rather than act as an independent nation, as, for example, New Zealand has. And I think New Zealand should be our model here, not Britain, or the United States, or China, or Korea, or Japan, or the Philippines, or Hong Kong, or India, or any other bugger you can think of. New Zealand is a smaller state than we are even, and yet they pursue a relatively civilized, independent political system. They have a standard of living which is the envy of the world. They've handled COVID virus better than any other country in the world, with maybe the exception of Australia. And they've done so without endangering their own security or their own civil rights and integrity. And there's the model for me, which doesn't answer your question, Joel, because your question can't be answered in this room. Your question can only be answered in Canberra. And unless we form a line outside the foreign ministers and the prime ministers and the treasurer's office a mile long every day, and don't let them leave their office until they answer the question, and every day until they get sick and tired of it and do something, there's nothing we can do about it.
Sounds like a good idea.
It is a good idea, but like all my ideas, I'm the only one that thinks they're a good idea.
Hannah, we've got another question.
Ian, I think one of the contributions to the low turnout of US voters is voter suppression, which I think many Australians don't understand. Can you succinctly cover that in a few minutes?
Yes. Well, I thought I alluded to that in a way with the reference to observers at polling booths, which is overt. And what it means is that if you go to, well, first of all, you have to register. And legislatures in each state have their rules about who can register. And that can involve in all sorts of ways. And right now, what's disturbing about this election is the number of people who are going to be surrounding the polling booths, scrutinising who votes and who they are, and checking things like saying to you, look, who are you? How long have you lived here? Where's your driver's? Oh, you haven't got your driver's? So go home and get it. And that means you don't even drive. No good telling me you don't